A Hells Angel stopped for a little girl at the train station. What she said changed everything. The rumble of Jake Mitchell's Harley-Davidson echoed through the empty train station as he rolled to a stop, the engine's growl fading into the quiet morning air. The station was little more than a weathered wooden platform with a small shelter, its blue paint peeling from years of sun and rain. A rusty clock hung above the ticket window, its hands frozen at 3:45. Jake switched off the engine and swung his leg over the motorcycle, his boots hitting the cracked pavement with a solid thud. His joints ached from the long ride, a reminder that he wasn't as young as he used to be. The leather of his vest creaked as he stretched, revealing glimpses of the tattoos that covered his arms, faded reminders of a life he was trying to leave behind. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the platform as Jake pulled off his riding gloves and tucked them into his back pocket. He ran a hand through his thick beard, feeling the silver strands that had started appearing more frequently. The station was deserted except for a sleepy-looking attendant visible through the ticket window, his nose buried in yesterday's newspaper. Jake walked to the edge of the platform, his heavy boots echoing in the stillness. The railroad tracks stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the misty morning horizon. This was just another stop on his journey to nowhere in particular, or at least that's what he told himself. The truth was, he was running from memories, from mistakes, from the life he'd built and destroyed with the Hells Angels. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding forest and the metallic tang of the railroad tracks. Jake pulled out a battered pack of cigarettes from his vest pocket, then paused, looking at it. With a heavy sigh, he stuffed it back unopened. Some habits were harder to break than others. A gentle breeze rustled through the nearby trees, carrying with it the distant whistle of an approaching train. Jake checked his watch. He still had time before he needed to move on. These moments of solitude had become precious to him, away from the chaos and violence that had defined his life for so long. As he stood there, something caught his eye. A small figure standing near the tracks about 50 yards down the platform. Jake squinted against the morning sun, making out the shape of a little girl, probably no more than 5 or 6 years old. She wore a pink backpack and clutched a teddy bear that had seen better days, its fur matted and worn. Jake's stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. Where were her parents? The girl shifted from foot to foot, her small shoulders hunched forward, radiating uncertainty and fear. Her presence here, alone, set off every alarm bell in Jake's head. He hesitated, his instincts warring with each other. The old Jake would have walked away. Other people's problems weren't his concern. But something about the girl's vulnerable solitude tugged at him, breaking through the walls he'd built around himself. Taking a deep breath, Jake began walking toward her, trying to make his imposing frame appear less threatening. He moved slowly, deliberately, aware that his appearance, the tattoos, the leather vest, the thick beard, might frighten her. The girl noticed his approach, her eyes growing wide as she clutched her teddy bear tighter to her chest. Jake's heart pounded as he drew closer, unsure of what he was going to say or do. All he knew was that a child alone at a train station was wrong, and despite everything in his past, he couldn't just walk away. Jake approached the little girl with careful steps, his boots making soft thuds against the wooden platform. As he got closer, he could see her better. Blonde pigtails tied with blue ribbons, a small scratch on her knee, and eyes that seemed too old for such a young face. Her teddy bear had definitely seen better days, with one ear slightly torn and patches of fur missing. Trying to appear less intimidating, Jake lowered himself to one knee, keeping a respectful distance. His leather vest creaked as he moved, and he noticed the girl watching the patches sewn onto it with curiosity rather than fear. "Hey there, kiddo," Jake said softly, his gruff voice gentler than usual. "Are you okay? Where's your mom or dad?" The girl tilted her head, studying his face with an intensity that made Jake uncomfortable. Her small fingers tightened around her teddy bear as she took a half-step forward. Then, with the simple clarity that only children possess, she said, "Mommy says you're my daddy." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He rocked back slightly, his mouth going dry. The morning air suddenly felt thick and heavy around him. His mind raced through faces and names from his past, trying to make sense of this impossible statement. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he managed to ask, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Emily," she replied, swaying slightly on her feet. "Mommy showed me your picture. She said you had drawings all over your arms, just like these." She pointed at his tattoos with a small finger. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. Emily. The name didn't ring any bells, but something about her face tugged at his memory. Those eyes, he'd seen them before, hadn't they? "Your mommy," Jake said carefully. "Is she here at the station?" Emily nodded vigorously, her pigtails bouncing. "She's supposed to meet me here. She said to wait right here and not move." Her lower lip trembled slightly. "But I've been waiting a long time." Jake remained frozen in place, his mind spinning. He'd been with women in the past, sure, but he'd always been careful, hadn't he? There was Sarah, years ago, but that had ended before. His thoughts trailed off as he looked at Emily again. How old was she? 5? 6? The girl took another step toward him, and Jake noticed she was shivering slightly in the morning air. Without thinking, he shrugged off his leather vest and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her tiny frame, making her look even smaller. "Thank you," she said, pulling it closer around herself. The simple gesture of trust made Jake's chest tighten with an unfamiliar feeling. He looked around the empty platform, seeing no sign of anyone who might be Emily's mother. The responsibility of the situation began to weigh on him. This child, this little girl who claimed he was her father, was alone and waiting for someone who hadn't shown up. Jake's past had taught him to run from complications, to avoid attachments, to keep moving. But as Emily stood there, wrapped in his vest, looking up at him with complete trust, he felt rooted to the spot. Something deeper than confusion or doubt was taking hold, a pull he couldn't explain, telling him he couldn't just walk away. Jake stood up slowly, his mind still reeling from Emily's words. The morning sun cast long shadows across the platform, and a cool breeze rustled through Emily's pigtails. She looked so small, so vulnerable in his oversized vest. "Let's go inside and see if we can find your mom," Jake said, his voice gentle. He held out his rough, calloused hand, and Emily slipped her tiny fingers into his palm without hesitation. The simple trust in that gesture made his throat tight. They walked toward the station's entrance, Emily taking 2 steps for every one of his. The glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing a nearly empty waiting area. A few plastic chairs lined the walls, and the ticket counter stood unmanned. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the worn linoleum floor. "Do you know your mom's phone number?" Jake asked, leading Emily to one of the chairs. She shook her head, clutching her teddy bear closer. "Mommy always says to wait here if anything happens," Emily explained, her voice small but certain. "She works at the flower shop down the street." She pointed vaguely towards the window. Jake ran a hand through his beard, trying to piece things together. A flower shop. Something stirred in his memory, Sarah had always loved flowers. But it couldn't be the same Sarah. Could it? "What's your mom's name, Emily?" he asked, his heart pounding. "Sarah Mitchell," Emily replied, swinging her legs back and forth on the chair. "Like me. I'm Emily Mitchell." Jake felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. Sarah Mitchell. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. 5 years ago, they'd had a brief but intense relationship. He'd left town before things got too serious, or so he'd thought. The timing. It all lined up. The sound of hurried footsteps drew their attention. A man in a navy blue uniform with a name tag reading "Station Manager" approached them, his face creased with concern. Jake instinctively moved closer to Emily. "Are you with this little girl?" the manager asked, looking between Jake and Emily. "I'm helping her find her mother," Jake explained, standing up straighter. "Sarah Mitchell?" The manager's expression grew more troubled. "Oh, thank goodness someone's with her. I've been trying to locate a guardian." He lowered his voice, glancing at Emily. "There's been an accident. Her mother was involved in a serious car crash this morning on her way to the station. She's at St. Mary's Hospital in critical condition." Jake felt his stomach drop. Emily, still sitting in the chair, looked up at them with wide eyes. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her small voice trembling. Jake knelt beside her chair, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Your mom had a little accident, sweetheart. She's at the hospital right now. Would it be okay if I took you to see her?" Emily nodded, clutching her teddy bear tighter. "Will Mommy be okay?" Jake felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. Whether he was really her father or not didn't matter right now. This little girl needed someone, and he was all she had. "The doctors are taking good care of her," Jake assured her, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. He turned to the station manager. "I'll take her to St. Mary's. Do you have the details of what happened?" The yellow taxi wound its way through the morning traffic, its tires humming against the pavement. Jake sat in the back seat, his large frame making the space feel cramped. Beside him, Emily looked even tinier than before, her feet barely reaching the edge of the seat. Her teddy bear, worn and loved, remained clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. Through the window, the town scrolled past in a blur of brick buildings and early morning shoppers. Jake's mind raced faster than the scenery. Sarah Mitchell. He hadn't heard that name in 5 years. The last time he'd seen her was on a warm summer evening, her eyes filled with tears as he rode away on his motorcycle. He'd convinced himself it was for the best, that someone like him couldn't offer the kind of life she deserved. Now, sitting in this taxi with a little girl who might be his daughter, that decision felt like a punch to the gut. Jake glanced down at Emily, studying her features. She had Sarah's nose, that same delicate slope. And something in the way she held herself, quiet but determined, reminded him of Sarah, too. The taxi driver caught his eye in the rearview mirror. "Everything okay back there?" he asked, his voice gentle, probably noticing the unusual pair they made, a tough-looking biker and a small girl with pigtails. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The morning had started like any other, with him planning to pass through town without stopping. Now, his whole world had shifted on its axis. Emily's small hand moved to touch one of the tattoos on his arm, a thunderbird, its wings spread wide. "Pretty," she whispered, tracing the outline with her finger. The simple gesture made Jake's throat tight. Kids usually shied away from him, scared by his appearance. But Emily showed no fear, just curiosity. Traffic slowed as they approached a red light. Outside, a mother walked hand in hand with a young boy, probably around Emily's age. They were laughing about something, their faces bright with joy. Jake felt a sharp pang in his chest. How many moments like that had he missed? How many bedtime stories and scraped knees and first days of school? The taxi turned onto Hospital Drive, the large white building looming ahead. Jake's stomach churned with anxiety. What would he find inside? What state would Sarah be in? And what right did he have to be here at all after walking away 5 years ago? Emily shifted in her seat, her small fingers working nervously at the teddy bear's ear. The stuffed animal looked well-loved, its fur matted in places, and one eye slightly loose. Jake wondered if it had been a gift from Sarah, if she'd tucked Emily into bed with it every night while he was out there somewhere, living his life as if they didn't exist. The hospital grew larger in the windshield, its windows reflecting the morning sun like hundreds of bright eyes. The taxi slowed, preparing to turn into the entrance. Jake could see the emergency room sign ahead, its red letters stark against the white building. Emily's voice broke through his thoughts, small and trembling. "Will Mommy be okay?" Jake looked down at her, seeing the fear in her eyes despite her brave face. He reached over and gave her small hand a gentle squeeze. "We'll find out," he said softly, wishing he could promise her more. The hospital's automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a blast of cool air that smelled of antiseptic and floor cleaner. Jake's heavy boots echoed against the polished tiles as he guided Emily through the busy entrance. All around them, people rushed back and forth, doctors in white coats, nurses with clipboards, worried family members clutching coffee cups. Emily's small hand tightened around Jake's calloused fingers. He looked down to find her staring wide-eyed at the bustling scene, her teddy bear tucked securely under her other arm. Despite the chaos of his thoughts, Jake felt a protective surge as he noticed her trembling lip. "It's okay, kiddo," he said, his gruff voice softer than usual. "Let's find someone who can help us." They approached the main desk, where a nurse sat typing at a computer. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly at Jake's appearance, the leather vest, the tattoos snaking up his arms, the thick beard. But when her gaze shifted to Emily, her expression softened. "Can I help you?" she asked, offering a gentle smile. "We're here for Sarah Mitchell," Jake said, his throat tightening around the name. "Car accident this morning. This is her daughter." The nurse's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Yes, Mrs. Mitchell was brought in a few hours ago." She stood up, coming around the desk. "I'm Nurse Chen. I'll take you to her room." They followed her through a maze of corridors, each one looking exactly like the last. Jake's mind whirled with questions. Could Emily really be his? The timing fit. 5 years ago, when he'd last seen Sarah, and there was something about the girl's determined little chin that reminded him of his own mother. Nurse Chen stopped outside a room marked 342. "The doctor will be by soon to discuss Mrs. Mitchell's condition," she said quietly. "She's stable for now, but—" She glanced at Emily and left the sentence unfinished. Jake nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Things weren't good. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rough. The nurse touched Emily's shoulder gently before walking away. Jake stood frozen for a moment, staring at the closed door. Behind it lay the woman he'd walked away from 5 years ago, and possibly the biggest mistake of his life. Emily tugged at his hand. "Can we go in?" she asked in a small voice. Jake took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The steady beep of monitors filled the air. Sarah lay still on the white hospital bed, her dark hair spread across the pillow. Tubes and wires connected her to various machines, making her seem smaller somehow, more fragile. A large bruise darkened one side of her face, and her right arm was wrapped in a cast. Emily let go of Jake's hand and moved quickly to the chair beside the bed. She climbed up, her movements careful and deliberate, as if afraid to disturb her mother. Setting her teddy bear in her lap, she reached out to touch Sarah's uninjured hand. Jake remained in the doorway, his chest tight with emotion. The scene before him felt surreal. This little girl who might be his daughter, the woman he'd never stopped thinking about. And him, a former Hell's Angel who'd spent the last 5 years running from his past. Now here he was, rooted to the spot by a responsibility he never knew he had. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a soft glow over mother and daughter. Jake watched as Emily gently stroked Sarah's hand, her small face pinched with worry, and felt something shift inside his heart. Jake slumped in the hard plastic chair of the waiting room, his large frame making the furniture seem even more uncomfortable than it already was. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his weathered face. His leather vest creaked as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles turned white. Emily had finally fallen asleep in the chair next to him, her teddy bear serving as a makeshift pillow. Every few minutes, she would stir and mumble something about her mother, making Jake's heart clench. Nurse Chen approached him with a clipboard, her shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. "Mr. Mitchell?" she said in a hushed tone, careful not to wake Emily. "I need to discuss some matters with you." Jake stood up, moving a few steps away from the sleeping child. "How is she?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Mrs. Mitchell's condition is critical," the nurse explained, glancing down at her notes. "We've been trying to locate Emily's father, but—" She hesitated, looking up at Jake with questioning eyes. "The contact information we have seems to be outdated." Jake ran a hand through his beard, memories flooding back. 5 years ago, he'd last seen Sarah. They'd spent 6 passionate months together before his lifestyle, the bikes, the gang, the constant trouble, had driven them apart. He'd chosen the road over settling down, convincing himself it was better that way. He started, then cleared his throat. "Sarah and we were together back then, but I didn't know about Emily until today." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. The nurse nodded sympathetically. "I see. Well, given the circumstances, we need someone who can make decisions regarding both Mrs. Mitchell and Emily's care, as the only adult present who has a connection to them." Jake's mind spun. He thought about his life on the road, the freedom he'd cherished so much. Now it felt empty compared to the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He glanced at Emily's sleeping form, seeing hints of Sarah in her peaceful face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll stay. Whatever they need." The nurse was explaining something about paperwork when the doctor appeared, his face grave. He gestured for Jake to join him, and they stepped into a quiet corner of the waiting room. "Mr. Mitchell," the doctor began, his voice low and serious. "I'm afraid Mrs. Mitchell's condition hasn't improved. The trauma from the accident caused significant swelling in her brain, and we're monitoring it closely. However—" He paused, adjusting his glasses. "If the pressure doesn't decrease soon, we may need to make some difficult decisions." Jake felt his stomach drop. He glanced back at Emily, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of how her world might change at any moment. His hands, capable of so much destruction in his past life, now felt useless. He couldn't fight this enemy, couldn't protect Emily from this pain. "What can we do?" he asked, hating how helpless he sounded. The doctor shook his head slightly. "For now, we wait and monitor. The next 24 hours will be crucial." He placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "I suggest you prepare yourself. Emily may need you more than ever." Jake nodded numbly, watching as the doctor walked away. He returned to his seat beside Emily, who stirred slightly at his presence. Looking at her small form, he knew he couldn't leave, wouldn't leave, no matter what came next. For the first time in his life, running away wasn't an option. The hospital corridor grew quieter as night settled in. Jake sat in the dimly lit room, his large frame awkwardly fitted into a reclining chair next to Sarah's bed. Emily had finally dozed off in his lap after hours of worried questions about her mother. The steady beeping of medical machines created a rhythm that matched his troubled thoughts. Jake looked down at Emily's peaceful face, then over at Sarah's still form. The sight of Sarah, so pale and quiet, was a stark contrast to the vibrant woman he remembered from 5 years ago. Her dark hair spread across the white hospital pillow, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision thanks to the breathing tubes. He shifted slightly, careful not to wake Emily. His leather vest felt out of place here, like a reminder of everything he'd chosen over having a real life. The tattoos that covered his arms told stories of wild nights, bar fights, and a brotherhood that had been his only family for so long. Now they just felt like marks of his mistakes. "What am I doing here?" he whispered to himself, his calloused hand absently stroking Emily's hair. The gesture came naturally, surprising him. Everything about Emily seemed to bypass his usual defenses. Her trust in him, despite his intimidating appearance, touched something deep inside that he thought had died years ago. Memories of his life with the Hells Angels flashed through his mind, the thundering motorcycles, the adrenaline rush of living on the edge, the false sense of belonging. He'd convinced himself it was freedom, but sitting here now, he realized it had been just another prison. He'd been running from something, from commitment, from love, from the possibility of letting someone down. Emily stirred in her sleep, clutching her teddy bear tighter. Jake adjusted the small blanket a nurse had brought earlier, making sure she was warm enough. The simple act of caring for her felt foreign, yet somehow right. He'd never imagined himself as anyone's father. The thought had always terrified him, mainly because he'd never had a good example to follow. His own father had been nothing but a shadow, leaving behind only bitter memories and trust issues. But Emily was different. She didn't see his rough exterior or his troubled past. To her, he was simply someone who stayed when she needed someone most. Her small hand rested against his chest, right over his heart, as if she had claimed that space for herself. The night stretched on, and Jake found himself studying Emily's features in the soft light. He could see traces of Sarah in her face, the same gentle curve of her nose, the same delicate eyebrows. But there was something else there too, something that made his heart race every time he looked at her. Could she really be his daughter? The timing matched up with when he and Sarah were together. Emily whimpered softly in her sleep, and Jake instinctively tightened his arms around her. "Shh," he whispered, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "I've got you, kiddo." As she settled back into peaceful sleep, Jake felt something shift inside him. Looking at this small, trusting child in his arms, he made a silent promise. No matter what happened next, no matter how uncertain everything was, he would protect her. He didn't know the first thing about being a father, but for Emily, he would try. For the first time in his life, running away wasn't an option he could even consider. Morning light filtered through the hospital window, casting long shadows across the room. Jake had just finished helping Emily eat her breakfast, a small bowl of cereal from the hospital cafeteria. She sat cross-legged on the chair next to Sarah's bed, humming softly to herself, while coloring in a book a kind nurse had brought her. Jake stretched his stiff muscles, his body aching from spending the night in the hospital chair. He hadn't left Emily's side since they arrived, afraid she might need him. The nurses had been kind enough to bring them both food and basic supplies, but he knew they couldn't stay like this forever. A knock on the door made them both look up. A man in an expensive suit stood in the doorway, his leather briefcase and perfectly pressed clothes a stark contrast to Jake's wrinkled t-shirt and worn leather vest. "Mr. Mitchell?" The man's voice was crisp and professional. "May I speak with you outside for a moment?" Jake glanced at Emily, who had returned to her coloring. "I'll be right outside the door," he told her softly. She nodded without looking up, her small hand gripping her crayon tighter. In the hallway, the man introduced himself as James Weber, a lawyer representing Richard Donovan. The name meant nothing to Jake until Weber continued speaking. "Mr. Donovan is Sarah Mitchell's legal husband," Weber explained, his tone measured and careful. "While they've been separated for some time, they never officially divorced. As Emily's stepfather and Sarah's legal spouse, he has certain rights that need to be addressed." Jake's stomach dropped. "What kind of rights?" Weber pulled out a manila envelope from his briefcase. "Mr. Donovan is seeking immediate emergency custody of Emily. Given the circumstances of Mrs. Mitchell's condition and your uncertain legal standing regarding the child, he believes it's in Emily's best interest to be placed in his care." Jake's fists clenched at his sides. Through the door's window, he could see Emily still coloring, unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down again. "I'm her father," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That may be," Weber replied, "but there's no legal documentation to support that claim. Mr. Donovan, on the other hand, has been Emily's legal guardian since his marriage to Sarah 3 years ago. The courts tend to favor established family units in these situations." The lawyer reached into the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. "This is a court summons for a custody hearing next week. Mr. Donovan is prepared to take full responsibility for Emily's care, while Mrs. Mitchell is indisposed." Jake took the papers with trembling hands. The legal language swam before his eyes, but phrases like immediate custody and unfit guardian jumped out at him. His throat felt tight as he looked back through the window at Emily, who was now showing her drawing to her unconscious mother. "How can he do this?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wasn't even here when she needed someone. I've been taking care of her." "For less than 48 hours, Weber pointed out diplomatically. "Mr. Donovan has resources and can provide stability. The courts will take that into consideration." Jake stood there, holding the court summons, feeling as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. Through the window, Emily looked up and waved at him, her smile bright and trusting. The thought of losing her to some stranger who happened to have a piece of paper saying he had more right to her than her own father made his chest ache. The lawyer cleared his throat. "I'll see you in court, Mr. Mitchell." He turned and walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the hospital floor, leaving Jake alone with the weight of papers that threatened to tear his newfound family apart. Jake sat in the dimly lit hospital waiting room, his weathered hands holding a small stack of photographs he'd found in Sarah's purse. The nurses had given him her personal belongings for safekeeping, and among them was a worn leather wallet containing these precious memories. His calloused thumb traced the edge of the first photo. It showed a younger version of himself, clean-shaven and smiling, with his arm around Sarah at some forgotten beach. Her long brown hair whipped in the wind, and her eyes sparkled with joy. Jake remembered that day. They'd driven his motorcycle down the coast, stopping wherever they pleased. "We were so young," he muttered to himself, flipping to the next picture. This one showed them at a small diner, Sarah making a silly face while Jake pretended to pour syrup on her head. Those first few months had been magical, full of laughter and spontaneity. Another photo revealed Sarah in his old leather jacket, looking tiny in the oversized garment but beaming with pride. The sight made his chest tight. He remembered how she used to steal that jacket, claiming it smelled like him. Back then, he thought her romantic notions were suffocating. Now he'd give anything to go back and shake some sense into his younger self. The timeline started adding up in his head. Their whirlwind romance had lasted about 6 months before he'd gotten spooked and run off. That was just about 6 years ago. His heart began to race as he counted backward. Emily was 5 years old. Jake pulled out his phone and opened the photo he'd taken of Emily earlier that day when she was coloring. He held it next to an old picture of Sarah at a similar age that he'd found in the wallet. The resemblance was striking. The same button nose, the same curve of the smile. But there was something else too, something that made his hands shake slightly. Emily had his eyes, the same steel blue color, the same slight tilt at the corners. Could it be true? He whispered, spreading the photos across his lap. Their brief relationship, the timing, Sarah's words to Emily about him being her daddy, it all started to make a terrifying kind of sense. "Mr. Thunder?" Emily's small voice startled him from his thoughts. She stood in front of him in her borrowed hospital pajamas, clutching her teddy bear. He quickly gathered the photos, but she'd already seen them. "Is that you and Mommy?" she asked, pointing to one that had slipped to the floor. Jake picked it up. It was the beach photo. "Yeah, kiddo, from a long time ago." Emily climbed onto the chair next to him, her teddy bear squished between them. She looked at the photo for a long moment, then up at Jake with those familiar blue eyes. "Are you really my daddy?" she asked softly, her voice small but clear. Jake's throat closed up. He stared at the little girl beside him, this child who'd crashed into his life less than 2 days ago. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Whether the DNA matched or not, he realized with startling clarity that his heart had already decided. He'd do anything to protect her, to keep her safe, to make her happy. The words wouldn't come. He sat there, speechless, as Emily waited patiently for an answer he wasn't sure how to give. The quiet of the hospital corridor shattered as expensive leather shoes clicked against the linoleum floor. Richard Donovan strode through the hallway like he owned it, his tailored suit setting him apart from the medical staff and worried visitors. His face wore the practiced smile of someone used to getting his way. Jake stood up instinctively as Richard approached, positioning himself between the newcomer and Emily, who was still holding her teddy bear. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "I'm here for my daughter," Richard announced, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of boardrooms and country clubs. He barely glanced at Jake, focusing instead on Emily with the kind of look someone might give a prized possession. Emily shrunk back in her chair, clutching her bear tighter. "I don't want to go with him," she whispered, just loud enough for Jake to hear. Richard's practiced smile tightened. "Emily, sweetheart, it's time to go home. I've already spoken with my lawyers, and they've assured me I have full legal rights to take you." Jake crossed his arms, his tattoos stark against his skin. "The girl says she doesn't want to go with you." Finally, Richard turned his attention to Jake, taking in his appearance with obvious distaste. "And who might you be? Some random stranger who thinks he has a say in my family matters?" "I'm her father," Jake said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Richard's laugh was cold and sharp. "Her father? Please! I've been married to Sarah for the past 3 years. I have the paperwork to prove my legal right to Emily's custody. Now step aside." He moved to reach for Emily, but Jake didn't budge. The old Thunder, the one who'd lived by the rules of the road and brotherhood, stirred inside him. But this wasn't about intimidation or violence. This was about protecting Emily. "You may have paperwork," Jake said, keeping his voice level. "But where were you when she was alone at the train station? Where were you when Sarah had her accident?" Richard's face flushed red. How dare you question my involvement? Security, he called out, his voice echoing down the hallway. This man is preventing me from taking my daughter. Emily began to cry softly, the sound cutting through Jake's heart like a knife. He knelt down beside her, keeping one eye on Richard. It's okay, kiddo. I'm not going anywhere. 2 security guards appeared, their faces uncertain as they assessed the situation. Richard immediately turned to them, pulling out what looked like legal documents from his expensive briefcase. This man, Richard said, pointing at Jake, is preventing me from leaving with my legal ward. I have the paperwork right here. The guards stepped forward, but Jake stood his ground. Check with the hospital staff, he said firmly. They know I've been here since Emily arrived. They know I'm listed as her emergency contact in Sarah's records. Emergency contact or not, Richard sneered. You have no legal right to keep her from me. He reached for Emily again, but Jake shifted, blocking his path. The security guards moved closer, their hands hovering near their belts. The tension in the hallway was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sir, one of the guards said to Richard, maybe we should take this discussion somewhere private. There's no need to upset the child further. Emily's quiet sobs had turned into hiccups, and she clung to Jake's leg like a lifeline. The sight of her distress seemed to give even the security guards pause. Richard's face twisted with anger. This is absurd. I demand you remove this man immediately. The hospital's playroom was a splash of color against the sterile white walls of the building. Sunlight streamed through large windows, casting warm patches on the carpet where scattered toys lay waiting. Jake sat in a child-sized chair that was much too small for his large frame, watching Emily as she carefully arranged plastic animals on a wooden table. This one's like your motorcycle, Emily said, holding up a black toy horse. Her eyes had dried from crying earlier, though her voice still carried a slight tremor. It goes fast, right? Jake couldn't help but smile. Yeah, kiddo, but not as fast as I used to ride it. He picked up a smaller horse figure and placed it next to hers. Now I'm more careful. Emily nodded seriously, as if she understood completely. She reached for her teddy bear, which never left her side, and hugged it close. Mr. Fuzzy likes when we're careful, too. A nurse poked her head in, checking on them. Jake had become a familiar sight in the pediatric ward over the past few days, and the staff had grown used to his intimidating appearance. Some even smiled when they saw how gentle he was with Emily. Would you like to draw something? Jake asked, noticing the art supplies in the corner. Maybe we could make a picture for your mom. Emily's face lit up. Can we? Mommy loves my drawings. She puts them on the fridge with the butterfly magnets. They moved to the art table, where Jake helped Emily arrange the colored papers and crayons. His large hands looked out of place among the children's art supplies, but he didn't mind. Emily chose a bright yellow crayon and began to draw. That's Mommy, she explained, pointing to a stick figure with long hair. And that's me. She added another smaller figure holding what looked like a teddy bear. Then she paused, crayon hovering over the paper. Can I draw you too? Jake's throat tightened. Sure, kiddo, if you want to. She drew him much larger than the other figures, complete with squiggly lines for his tattoos. Mommy has a picture of you, she said suddenly, concentrating on her drawing. In her special box. She looks at it sometimes when she's sad. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't known Sarah kept any memories of him. She does? Emily nodded, switching to a blue crayon. She says you used to make her laugh a lot. She stopped drawing and looked up at him with those serious eyes that seemed too old for her young face. I miss her laugh. I miss her telling me stories before bed. Jake moved closer, letting Emily lean against him. I know you do, sweetheart. When will she wake up? Emily's voice was small, barely a whisper. I want her to wake up. Jake felt helpless in the face of her pain. He wished he could promise her that Sarah would be fine, that everything would work out perfectly. But he couldn't lie to her. Instead, he gently turned her to face him. I don't know when your mommy will wake up, he said honestly. But I promise you this. I'll be here for you. I'll keep you safe. Emily studied his face with that solemn look of hers. Promise, promise? Promise, promise, Jake said firmly, though his own heart ached with uncertainty about how he could keep that promise with Richard fighting for custody. Emily hugged him then, her small arms barely reaching around his broad shoulders. Thank you, Daddy, she whispered. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket as he sat in the hospital cafeteria. Emily was napping in Sarah's room under the watchful eye of a kind nurse who had taken a liking to her. The caller ID showed an unknown number, and Jake's stomach tightened as he answered. Mr. Mitchell, a crisp voice said. This is Harrison Wells, representing Richard Donovan. I'm calling to inform you that we'll be filing for emergency custody of Emily Mitchell first thing tomorrow morning. Jake's fingers tightened around the phone. You can't do that. She needs stability right now. Mr. Donovan is her legal father according to the marriage certificate, the lawyer continued, his tone coldly professional. Your presence is merely confusing an already difficult situation for the child. Listen here, Jake growled, but kept his voice low. That man hasn't been in her life. He doesn't even know her favorite color. The courts tend to favor legal documentation over emotional attachments, Wells replied. I suggest you prepare yourself for the inevitable. After the call ended, Jake sat there, his coffee growing cold. The cafeteria's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he pulled out another number from his wallet, one he hadn't used in years. Mac's Legal Services, a gruff voice answered. Mac, it's Thunder. There was a pause. Thunder? Been a while, brother. You finally in trouble with the law? Not exactly. Jake ran a hand through his beard. I need advice about custody rights. 20 minutes later, Jake stood outside a small law office in downtown. The sign was faded, but the windows were clean and well kept. Mac Carson had left the club life behind years ago, trading his leather for a law degree. He was living proof that people could change. Mac looked different in a suit, his old club tattoos hidden beneath crisp sleeves, but his handshake was as firm as ever. Tell me everything, he said, gesturing to a chair. Jake explained the situation. Emily, Sarah's accident, Richard's sudden appearance. With each detail, Mac's expression grew more serious. This won't be easy, Mac said finally, leaning back in his chair. Richard's got money and legal standing, but there might be angles we can work. He pulled out a legal pad. First, we need to establish your connection to Sarah and Emily. Any documentation? Letters, photos, anything proving your relationship with Sarah? Jake thought about what Emily had said about the special box. Maybe. Sarah kept some things. Good, we'll need those. Mac made notes. Next, we need to look into Richard's past. His relationship with Sarah, any history of abuse or neglect. The fact that he's been absent from Emily's life works in our favor, but we need proof. Sarah's friends might know something, Jake said, remembering the nurses mentioning some visitors. And there must be hospital records. Mac nodded. Get me everything you can. Police reports, witness statements, medical records. If there's a pattern of behavior, we can use it. He looked up at Jake. But listen, brother, the most important thing right now is Emily. Document everything, every interaction, every conversation. Show that you're actively involved in her care. I'm not leaving her, Jake said firmly. Good. Mac started writing again. We'll need character references too. People who can vouch for your stability, your changed lifestyle. The court will look at your past, but we can show who you are now. Jake thought about the hospital staff who'd seen him with Emily, how they'd grown to accept his presence. I can get those. Start gathering everything, Mac said, handing Jake a list. And Thunder? This is going to get messy before it gets better. You ready for that? Jake thought of Emily's trusting face, her small hand in his. I have to be. Jake sat in the hospital's small library, surrounded by newspapers and his laptop. The gentle hum of fluorescent lights filled the quiet space as his fingers moved across the keyboard. Emily was having lunch with one of the kind nurses who'd offered to watch her, giving Jake precious time to dig into Richard's past. Come on, he muttered, scrolling through old news articles. Show me something. A notification popped up from one of Sarah's friends who had responded to his message. Jake clicked it open, his eyes widening as he read. Sarah used to call me crying, the message read. Richard would tell her she was worthless, that she couldn't do anything right. He controlled all their money, checked her phone, told her who she could talk to. Jake's jaw clenched. He'd seen this type of control before. Men who used money and fear to keep others down. He kept digging, finding more pieces of the puzzle. Hospital records showed Sarah had made several emergency room visits during her marriage to Richard. Sprains, bruises, a broken wrist. All explained away as accidents. But the pattern was clear. Jake copied everything, sending it straight to Mac. A nurse Jake recognized approached his table. Mr. Mitchell, I overheard you asking about Sarah and Richard earlier. She glanced around nervously. I was working here when Sarah came in a few times. She'd make excuses, but... The nurse handed him a thick manila envelope. These are copies of her charts. I kept them, just in case. Jake's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Inside were medical reports, photographs, and nurses' notes documenting Sarah's injuries. One photo showed Sarah with a dark bruise across her cheek, her eyes full of fear. Thank you, Jake said quietly. The nurse nodded and hurried away. More messages came in from Sarah's friends. They painted a picture of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, controlled by a man who saw her as property. Richard had disappeared after their divorce, showing no interest in Emily until now. Jake found court records of restraining orders Sarah had filed, then mysteriously withdrawn. Bank statements showed Richard had emptied their joint accounts before leaving. Everything pointed to a man who used power and money to get his way. His phone buzzed. Another message from one of Sarah's friends. He's only doing this to hurt Sarah. He never cared about Emily before. He used to say having a child was Sarah's biggest mistake. That was enough. Jake gathered the documents, making sure Mac had copies of everything. He couldn't sit here anymore, not while Richard plotted to take Emily away. He found Richard in the hospital parking lot, talking on his phone next to a shiny black Mercedes. Jake's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached. Richard ended his call, turning with an annoyed expression. What do you want? I know what you did to Sarah, Jake said, his voice low and steady. I know about the abuse, the control, everything. Richard's face hardened. You don't know anything. I know you never wanted Emily. I know you're only doing this to hurt Sarah. Jake stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. I'm telling you now, leave Emily alone. Or what? Richard sneered. You'll hit me? Show everyone what kind of violent man you really are? No, Jake said calmly. I'm not that person anymore. But I will protect that little girl from you, whatever it takes. Richard's mask slipped for a moment, showing a flash of uncertainty. You have no right. I have every right, Jake cut him off. I'm her father. Maybe not by blood or paper, but in all the ways that matter, and I'm not letting you anywhere near her. Jake returned to Emily's room after his confrontation with Richard, his mind still churning with anger. but the sight of the little girl coloring at the small hospital table melted away his tension. She looked up at him with Sarah's eyes, warm and full of trust. "Did you draw something new?" Jake asked, pulling up a chair beside her. Emily nodded, pushing her drawing toward him. "It's Mommy's garden. She always lets me help plant the flowers." Her crayon moved across the paper, adding splashes of yellow and pink. "She says the prettiest flowers are the ones we grow together." Jake studied the picture, noticing a tall figure standing next to a smaller one. "Who's that?" "That's you," Emily said matter-of-factly. "Mommy has a picture of you in her special box. She takes it out sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping." Jake's breath caught in his throat. She has a picture of me?" Emily put down her crayon and looked at him seriously. "Mommy says you were her special angel, even though you didn't know it. She said you saved her once, when some bad men were being mean to her." The memory hit Jake like a thunderbolt. It was years ago, outside a bar. Sarah had been surrounded by 3 drunk guys who wouldn't take no for an answer. He'd stepped in, not knowing then how that moment would change his life. "She tells me stories about you sometimes," Emily continued, picking up a blue crayon. "About how you gave her your jacket when it was raining, and how you always made her laugh with silly jokes." Jake remembered that jacket, his old leather one with the patches. He'd draped it over Sarah's shoulders during an unexpected downpour, watching her smile as she pulled it tight around herself. "Mommy says you have a good heart," Emily said, her small hand reaching out to pat his arm. "She says sometimes people with the biggest hearts hide them the most." Jake swallowed hard, fighting back the emotion threatening to overflow. "Your mommy is a smart lady." "She misses you," Emily said softly. "She keeps the ring you gave her in her special box, too. The one with the little blue stone." Jake remembered that ring. A simple silver band with a small turquoise stone he'd found at a craft fair. It wasn't worth much, but Sarah had treated it like treasure. "Sometimes," Emily continued, her voice growing quieter, "when Mommy looks at the picture, she cries a little. But she always says they're happy tears because you gave her the best gift ever." "What gift was that?" Jake asked, his voice rough with emotion. Emily smiled, pointing to herself. "Me, silly. Mommy says I have your smile." Jake looked at Emily's face, really looked, and saw what he'd been afraid to see before. The curve of her mouth when she smiled, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners just like his did. Later that night, after Emily had fallen asleep clutching her teddy bear, Jake sat in the dim light of the hospital room. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, thinking about everything Emily had shared. The love Sarah had kept alive all these years, the stories she'd told their daughter, the memories she'd treasured. Looking at Emily's peaceful face, Jake realized something profound. DNA tests and legal papers didn't matter anymore. This little girl had already claimed a piece of his heart that he could never take back. He wasn't just fighting for custody now. He was fighting for his daughter, for the family he never knew he wanted, for the love that had been waiting for him all along. Jake sat in the hospital's records office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he carefully read through Sarah's medical history. His hands trembled slightly as he turned each page, searching for answers. A birth certificate caught his eye. His heart stopped when he saw the date. Exactly 5 years ago. But what made his breath catch was the father's name, left deliberately blank. The mother's signature, Sarah's flowing script, filled the bottom of the page. "Mr. Mitchell?" A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Nancy, an older nurse with kind eyes who had been caring for Sarah since her admission. "I've brought you Sarah's personal effects from storage." She placed a small box on the desk. Jake nodded his thanks, watching as she hesitated before leaving. Inside the box, he found Sarah's wallet, a set of keys, and a worn leather journal. His fingers traced the journal's cover before opening it. The first entry was dated 5 years ago. "Dear Jake, I wish you could have seen her today. She has your eyes, your smile. The doctors say she's perfect. I named her Emily. I remember you once said you liked that name." Jake's vision blurred. He flipped through more pages, each one filled with entries addressed to him. Stories about Emily's first steps, her first words, moments he'd missed. Sarah had documented everything, like she was saving these memories to share with him someday. Between the pages, he found a photograph. It showed him and Sarah outside that old diner where they used to meet. His younger self had his arm around her, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. The date on the back was exactly 9 months before Emily's birth. "I always knew she'd tell you eventually," Nancy's voice came from the doorway. Jake looked up, finding the nurse watching him with understanding eyes. She moved into the room, closing the door behind her. "You knew?" Jake's voice was hoarse. Nancy pulled up a chair. "Sarah and I became close during her prenatal visits. She was alone, scared, but so determined to give Emily the best life possible." She paused, smoothing her scrubs. "She told me about you, about how you were trying to leave your old life behind. She didn't want to burden you while you were getting clean." Jake's shoulders slumped. He remembered those dark days, fighting to break free from his past. "She could have told me. I would have—" "Would you have been ready then?" Nancy asked gently. "Sarah believed in you, Jake. She knew you needed time to find yourself first. But she never stopped loving you, and she made sure Emily knew about her daddy." Jake picked up the journal again, his fingers tracing Sarah's handwriting. Was she ever going to tell me?" Nancy reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope, slightly creased but unopened. "She gave me this 3 months ago, asked me to hold on to it until she found the courage to send it." She handed it to Jake. "It's addressed to you." Jake stared at his name, written in Sarah's familiar handwriting. The letter felt heavy in his hands, weighted with unspoken words and lost time. "She talked about you all the time," Nancy continued softly. "Said she'd been working up the courage to find you, to tell you about Emily. She wanted to make sure you were ready, that you'd both have your best chance at being a family." She stood up, placing a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "She was planning to contact you next month, after Emily's birthday." Jake clutched the letter, his mind racing with all the what-ifs and could-have-beens. The truth was finally clear. Emily wasn't just a child who needed his help. She was his daughter, his flesh and blood, and Sarah had loved him enough to wait until he could be the father their little girl deserved. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the playground as Jake watched Emily climb the steps to the slide. His mind was still reeling from last night's discovery, but seeing her laugh made everything feel right. The park was quiet this early, with only a few other families dotting the landscape. "Watch me, Jake," Emily called out, her small hands gripping the rails of the slide. "I'm watching, sweetheart," he replied, his heart swelling at her excitement. The word sweetheart felt natural now, knowing she was truly his. She zoomed down the yellow plastic slope, her pigtails flying behind her. Jake sat on a nearby bench, taking in every detail of her face. His eyes, Sarah's smile, the perfect blend of them both. How had he not seen it before? Emily ran back to the steps for another go, her shoes lighting up with each bouncing step. "You want to try the swings?" he asked when she reached the bottom again. Her face lit up, and she nodded eagerly. Jake followed her to the swing set, his leather jacket feeling out of place among the cheerful playground equipment. He lifted her onto the seat, making sure she had a good grip on the chains. "Hold on tight," he instructed, moving behind her. He gave her a gentle push, and her delighted giggle filled the air. "Higher!" she squealed, pumping her legs like Sarah must have taught her. As he pushed her, Jake found himself making promises, each one rising from deep within his heart. "We'll do this every weekend," he said, "and I'll teach you to ride a bike when you're ready." "Really?" Emily's eyes sparkled with joy. "Really?" Jake confirmed, giving her another push. "We can get ice cream after the park, and maybe—" He hesitated, then continued. "Maybe we can look for a house with a backyard. Would you like that?" Emily nodded enthusiastically. "Can we get a puppy, too?" Jake chuckled, surprised by how easily he answered. "We'll see about that." After the swings, they settled on a checkered blanket Jake had brought, sharing sandwiches and apple juice. Emily sat close to him, her small shoulder pressing against his arm. "Your mommy used to bring you here?" Jake asked softly. Emily nodded, taking a bite of her sandwich. "She said it was her favorite park. She told me stories about you here sometimes." Jake's throat tightened. "What kind of stories?" "About how you helped people, even when you looked scary to others." Emily looked up at him with complete trust. "She said you had a good heart." Jake wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Your mommy is a very smart lady." "I knew you were my daddy," Emily said suddenly, her voice quiet but sure. "Mommy showed me your picture lots of times." Jake felt tears threatening to form in his eyes. He pulled Emily onto his lap, holding her like the precious gift she was. "I'm sorry I wasn't there before, Emily, but I'm here now, and I promise I'll always be here for you." Emily turned in his embrace, wrapping her small arms around his neck in a tight hug. "I'm glad you're my daddy," she whispered against his shoulder. Jake held her closer, his heart fuller than it had ever been. "I promise," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never let you go." Jake tugged at his borrowed tie, feeling like it was choking him. The courtroom's polished wooden benches and formal atmosphere made him even more uncomfortable. His lawyer friend, Mike, sat beside him, sorting through papers with practiced calm. Across the aisle, Richard lounged in an expensive suit, whispering to his high-priced attorney. Emily sat in the back with a court-appointed guardian, her teddy bear clutched tightly to her chest. Jake wanted nothing more than to go to her, but he had to stay put. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, called the court to order. "We're here today to determine custody arrangements for Emily Mitchell," she announced, her voice firm and clear. Richard's lawyer stood first, his shoes clicking on the hardwood floor. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Richard Donovan, was married to Sarah Mitchell at the time of Emily's birth. Under the law, this establishes him as the legal father. Mr. Donovan can provide Emily with financial security, private schooling, and a stable home environment." Jake's hands clenched into fists under the table. Mike squeezed his shoulder, reminding him to stay calm. "Furthermore," Richard's lawyer continued, "Mr. Mitchell's background raises serious concerns. His association with the Hells Angels motorcycle gang and his criminal record make him an unsuitable guardian for a young child." Jake felt his face grow hot. Every mistake from his past was being laid bare, twisted to make him sound like a monster. He glanced back at Emily, who gave him a small wave. His heart ached. When it was their turn, Mike stood up. "Your Honor, we have evidence that proves Jake Mitchell is Emily's biological father. We also have testimony from hospital staff about the dedication he's shown in caring for Emily during her mother's hospitalization." Mike presented DNA test results and character statements from the hospital nurses. "Mr. Mitchell may have a complicated past, but he's demonstrated remarkable change. He's been Emily's primary caregiver for the past weeks, showing patience, love, and commitment." The judge turned to Richard. "Mr. Donovan, Our records show you've had minimal contact with Emily throughout her life. Can you explain your sudden interest in custody? Richard cleared his throat. Your Honor, I was respecting Sarah's wishes by staying away. But now that she's incapacitated, I feel it's my duty to step in and provide Emily with the life she deserves. Jake couldn't stay quiet anymore. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Your Honor, may I speak? The judge nodded, studying him carefully. I know my past isn't pretty, Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. I've made mistakes, but Emily, she's changed everything. I've been there every day, reading her stories, holding her hand when she cries for her mom, making sure she eats her vegetables. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I'm not perfect, but I love her. She's my daughter, and I'll spend the rest of my life being the father she deserves. Richard scoffed loudly, earning a sharp look from the judge. I've seen the police reports about your treatment of Sarah, Jake continued, looking directly at Richard. The emotional abuse, the control, the neglect. Emily deserves better than that. Richard's face darkened. His lawyer jumped up with objections, but the damage was done. The judge raised her hand for silence. I think we all need time to process this information. We'll take a 30-minute recess. As people began to move, Emily broke away from her guardian and ran to Jake. He caught her in his arms, lifting her up. Did I do good? She whispered in his ear. Jake hugged her tighter, drawing strength from her trust. You did perfect, sweetheart. You just keep being brave. Emily pulled back to look at him, her eyes full of complete faith. You too, Daddy. You be brave too. Jake pulled his motorcycle into the hospital parking lot, the familiar sight of the building now oddly comforting after weeks of visits. He needed these precious minutes of the court recess to clear his head, and there was only one place he wanted to be. The hospital corridors were quiet during the afternoon lull. Jake's heavy boots squeaked against the freshly waxed floor as he made his way to Sarah's room. The steady beeping of machines greeted him as he entered, a sound that had become the backdrop to his many visits. Sarah lay still, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting warm stripes across her peaceful face. Jake settled into the worn chair beside her bed, the same one where he'd spent countless hours with Emily. Hey, Sarah, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. I'm in court right now, fighting for our little girl. He reached out and took her hand, careful of the IV line. Emily, she's amazing, you know? Smart and brave, just like her mom. Jake's thumb traced circles on Sarah's palm as memories flooded back. Remember that summer we spent riding up the coast? You weren't afraid of anything back then. Not the bike, not the speed, not even me. He smiled sadly. I was the scared one. Scared of letting anyone get too close. The machines beeped steadily as Jake continued. I messed up, Sarah. I should have been there when you found out about Emily. Should have been there for her first steps, her first words. His voice cracked. But I'm here now, and I'm not running away this time. He leaned forward in the chair, still holding her hand. Richard showed up. He's trying to take Emily away. Jake's jaw clenched. But I won't let him. I've seen how she flinches when he raises his voice. I've heard the stories from the nurses about how he treated you. A nurse passed by the door, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum. Jake waited until she passed before speaking again. Emily needs me, Sarah. She needs someone who'll put her first, who'll love her unconditionally. I know I've got a past, but she makes me want to be better, makes me want to be the kind of father she deserves. Jake stood up, pacing the small room. You should see her in court, Sarah. So brave, holding that teddy bear you gave her. She waves at me when she thinks nobody's looking. He smiled, remembering Emily's encouraging little face. She's got your spirit, that's for sure. Returning to Sarah's bedside, Jake noticed something on the nightstand he hadn't seen before. Tucked behind a vase of fresh flowers was a photograph. He picked it up carefully, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized it. The photo showed him and Sarah on his motorcycle, parked at sunset on a coastal cliff. Sarah's arms were wrapped around his waist, her head thrown back in laughter. Jake remembered that day perfectly. The salt air, the rumble of his bike, the way Sarah's trust in him had made him feel 10 feet tall. Looking at the photo, then at Sarah's still form, Jake felt something settle in his chest, a certainty he hadn't felt before. This was his family, Sarah and Emily, and he would move heaven and earth to protect them. He placed the photo back carefully and squeezed Sarah's hand one last time. "I've got to get back to court now," he said softly. "But I promise you, Sarah, I'm going to make this right. I'm going to be the man you always believed I could be." The courtroom felt suffocating as Jake straightened his tie for the 100th time. His lawyer had convinced him to wear a suit instead of his usual leather jacket, but the stiff fabric made him feel like a stranger in his own skin. Still, he'd do anything for Emily. Emily sat in the front row with a social worker, her teddy bear clutched tightly to her chest. When she caught Jake's eye, she gave him a small wave, and his heart squeezed. She looked so tiny in the massive wooden courtroom, her feet barely touching the floor. Richard sat at the opposite table, perfectly groomed in an expensive suit, his lawyer shuffling papers importantly. The sight of him made Jake's jaw clench. Over the past weeks, evidence of Richard's controlling behavior and emotional abuse had come to light, painting a dark picture of Sarah's marriage. Jake's lawyer touched his arm lightly. "Remember what we discussed," she whispered. "Stay calm, no matter what happens. The judge has seen the evidence. Emily's testimony about how Richard treated her mother was very compelling." Jake nodded, trying to control his breathing. The past few months had changed him completely. The man who once lived only for himself, who roared down highways with no destination in mind, now sat in a courtroom fighting to be a father. The irony wasn't lost on him. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Martinez presiding." Everyone stood as the judge entered, her black robes swishing as she took her seat. She adjusted her glasses, looking over the courtroom with practiced neutrality. "Before I deliver my verdict," Judge Martinez began, "I want to address something. This case has been unusual, to say the least." She looked directly at Jake. "Mr. Mitchell, when you first appeared in my courtroom, I had serious reservations. Your history with the Hells Angels, your lack of permanent residence, your previous lifestyle, none of it suggested stability." Jake's heart sank, but he kept his face steady. Emily was watching. "However," the judge continued, "what I've witnessed over these proceedings has been remarkable. The evidence presented shows not just your biological connection to Emily, but your unwavering commitment to her well-being. The testimonies from hospital staff about your dedication during Sarah's hospitalization, your efforts to create a stable home environment, and most importantly, Emily's own obvious attachment to you, these paint a very different picture." She turned to Richard. "Mr. Wells, while you may have legal standing as Sarah's husband, the evidence of your past behavior is deeply troubling. The court's primary concern must always be the child's best interest." Jake held his breath. Emily hugged her teddy bear tighter. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, and taking into account the recommendations of Child Services, Judge Martinez paused, looking at her papers one final time. "This court grants full custody of Emily Mitchell to her biological father, Jake Mitchell, pending Sarah Mitchell's recovery." The words hit Jake like a physical force. His legs went weak, and he gripped the table to steady himself. Emily let out a small squeal of delight, and the social worker had to gently hold her back from running to him. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge concluded, "the court's faith in you is not unlimited. You will continue to meet regularly with child services and maintain stable housing and employment. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Jake managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Your Honor. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, but Jake barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on Emily, whose face was beaming with joy. In that moment, as relief and happiness washed over him, Jake knew that his life would never be the same. Jake stood in the empty bedroom of his newly rented house, running his hand along the freshly painted light blue walls. The room wasn't huge, but it had a big window that let in plenty of sunlight. It was perfect for a little girl. What do you think about this spot for your bed, kiddo? Jake asked Emily, who was spinning in circles in the middle of the room, making her dress twirl. Can I have it under the window? She asked, stopping to point. That way I can see the stars at night. Jake smiled, his heart warming at her excitement. Just a few months ago, he'd been a different man. Rough, angry, always running from something. Now here he was, paint splattered on his old jeans, discussing bedroom layouts with his 5-year-old daughter. The window it is, he agreed. He checked his watch. The furniture delivery should be here soon. Want to help me unpack some of your new things while we wait? Emily nodded eagerly, following Jake to the living room where several shopping bags sat. They'd spent the morning at the mall, Jake's first time shopping for children's items. The experience had been overwhelming, but Emily's joy made it worth it. Together they began pulling items from the bags. A soft purple comforter with butterflies, matching pillowcases, a nightlight that projected stars onto the ceiling, stuffed animals to keep her teddy bear company. Each item they unpacked made Emily's eyes light up brighter. Look, Daddy, she exclaimed, pulling out a white dress with yellow flowers. Can I wear this when we visit Mommy tomorrow? Jake's throat tightened at the mention of Sarah, still unconscious in the hospital. Of course you can, sweetheart. Mommy would love to see you in it. The doorbell rang. The delivery truck had arrived. Jake directed the workers as they brought in the white bedroom set he'd chosen, a twin bed, a small dresser, and a bookshelf. Emily watched from the doorway, bouncing on her toes with excitement. Once the furniture was in place, Jake began the task of setting everything up. Emily helped by arranging her stuffed animals on the bed and filling the bookshelf with the children's books they'd bought. Jake couldn't help but marvel at how naturally she settled into the space, as if she'd always belonged there. Can we put up the fairy lights now? Emily asked, pointing to the string of twinkling lights they'd picked out. You got it, Princess. Jake climbed onto a stepladder, carefully hanging the lights around the perimeter of the room. Emily directed him from below, making sure the spacing was perfect. As evening approached, Jake hung colorful curtains while Emily organized her new clothes in the dresser drawers. The room was coming together beautifully, a perfect blend of comfort and whimsy, just right for a little girl. Ready for the big moment? Jake asked, holding the fairy lights plug. Emily nodded enthusiastically. Jake flipped off the overhead light and plugged in the fairy lights. The room transformed instantly, bathed in a soft, magical glow. The star projector cast gentle patterns across the ceiling, and the fairy lights twinkled like tiny stars. It's beautiful, Emily whispered, her face full of wonder. Jake watched his daughter twirling again in her new room, this time under the twinkling lights. His chest felt full to bursting with love and hope. This room represented more than just a place for Emily to sleep. It was the beginning of their new life together, a symbol of all the changes he'd made, and would continue to make for her. Jake stirred the pot of macaroni and cheese on the stove, adding an extra sprinkle of shredded cheddar just the way Emily liked it. The kitchen was warm and cozy, filled with the sounds of Emily humming as she set the table with the plastic plates they'd picked out together. Bright yellow for her, blue for him. Did you have fun at the park today? Jake asked, spooning the mac and cheese into their plates. He'd taken her there after they finished setting up her room, needing a break from all the unpacking. Uh-huh, Emily nodded enthusiastically, climbing onto her chair. I went super high on the swings, and I made a friend named Katie. She has a puppy. Jake sat down across from her, watching as she dug into her dinner with gusto. A puppy, huh? He tried not to smile too broadly at her obvious hint. She said her puppy likes to chase butterflies, Emily continued between bites. And he sleeps in a special bed next to hers. She looked up at Jake with hopeful eyes. Do you think maybe someday? We'll see, Jake chuckled, reaching over to wipe a spot of cheese from her chin with a napkin. Let's get settled in first, okay? Emily nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer for now. I drew a picture at the park, too. Want to see? Of course I do. She hopped down from her chair and ran to her backpack, returning with a slightly crumpled piece of paper. Jake carefully smoothed it out on the table. The crayon drawing showed 3 figures, a tall one with what looked like a beard, a small one in a dress, and a person lying in what he assumed was a hospital bed. That's you, Emily pointed to the bearded figure. And that's me, and that's Mommy. See? I drew her sleeping, but I made her smile because I know she's happy we're together. Jake swallowed hard, touched by her simple wisdom. It's beautiful, sweetheart. We'll hang it on the fridge, okay? They finished their dinner, sharing stories and giggling over silly jokes. Emily told him about all the things she wanted to do in their new home. Plant flowers, build a fort in the living room, maybe get that puppy someday. Jake found himself getting caught up in her enthusiasm, making mental notes of her ideas. After dinner, they worked together to clean up. Jake washed the dishes while Emily dried them with a towel, standing on her step-stool beside him. It was such a simple moment, but Jake felt its importance deep in his soul. This was what family felt like. As they finished up, Emily suddenly wrapped her arms around Jake's waist, pressing her face against his side. Thank you for being my daddy, she said softly. Jake had to grip the edge of the sink for a moment, his vision blurring with unexpected tears. He knelt down to her level, gathering her in his arms. Thank you for being my daughter, he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. I'll always be here for you, Emily. Always. She hugged him tighter, and Jake held on, marveling at how this small person had completely transformed his life. The tough biker, who once thought he didn't need anyone, now couldn't imagine life without his daughter's love. The kitchen was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic outside. In that moment, Jake felt more peaceful than he had in years, holding his daughter in their new home, building a life he never knew he wanted but now couldn't live without. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors when Sarah's eyes fluttered open. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across her bed. She blinked slowly, trying to focus on her surroundings. A nurse noticed her stirring and quickly rushed to her side. Welcome back, Mrs. Mitchell, the nurse said softly, checking her vital signs. You've been in a coma for several weeks. Sarah's throat felt dry, and her voice came out as a whisper. Emily, where's my daughter? She's safe, the nurse assured her, helping Sarah take small sips of water. She's with her father. Sarah's eyes widened with concern, but before she could speak, the nurse continued. Jake's been taking care of her. He's been here almost every day with Emily, reading to you, talking to you. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as the nurse explained everything that had happened. The custody battle with Richard, Jake's unwavering dedication to Emily, and the court's decision to grant Jake full custody. The nurse described how Jake had transformed from a rough-looking biker into a devoted father, how he'd created a stable home for Emily, and how their daughter had flourished under his care. "He fought for her," the nurse said, adjusting Sarah's pillows. "You should have seen him in court. He stood up against Richard with everything he had. Emily adores him." Sarah closed her eyes, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. She'd always known, somewhere deep in her heart, that Jake had goodness in him. That's why she'd told Emily about him, shown her his picture, kept him alive in their daughter's memories even though he wasn't there. Later that afternoon, Jake appeared in the doorway of her room. He looked different from how she remembered him, still tall and imposing, but his eyes were softer, his stance less defensive. Emily wasn't with him. The nurse had mentioned she was at school. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He moved to her bedside, taking a seat in the chair that had become his regular spot over the past weeks. "Jake," she whispered, reaching for his hand. He took it, his large fingers wrapping gently around hers. "Thank you for everything." "I should have been there sooner," he said, his voice rough. "All those years." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You're here now. That's what matters." She paused, gathering her strength. "The nurse told me what you did, how you fought for her, how you've changed." Jake looked down at their clasped hands. "She changed me, Sarah. Emily. She made me want to be better, to be worthy of being called her father." "I'm sorry I never told you about her," Sarah said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I was afraid you weren't ready, afraid you'd reject her. I should have given you the chance." "And I'm sorry I gave you reason to doubt me," Jake replied. "But you did something amazing. You kept me alive in her heart. You could have made her hate me, but instead, you made it possible for her to love me." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, years of misunderstandings and hurt melting away. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice stronger. "I'm proud of you, Jake. You've become the father I always hoped you could be, the father Emily needs." Jake's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he squeezed Sarah's hand gently. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the hospital room floor as they sat together, united in their love for their daughter and their hopes for the future. Jake's old motorcycle rumbled down the coastal road, with Emily securely seated in the car following behind, driven by a close friend. The morning sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange as they approached the beach. It was their first real outing as father and daughter since Sarah had woken up, and Jake wanted to make it special. They pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. Emily jumped out of the car, her pink sundress fluttering in the ocean breeze. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she clutched her beach bag filled with sand toys and snacks. "Daddy, look! The waves are so big!" she exclaimed, pointing at the rolling surf. Jake couldn't help but smile. The word "daddy" still felt new and wonderful every time she said it. He grabbed their beach chairs and umbrella from his friend's car, thanking him for the ride. "Ready for an adventure, kiddo?" Jake asked, adjusting his sunglasses. Emily nodded enthusiastically, already kicking off her sandals to feel the sand between her toes. Jake watched as she ran ahead, her golden hair catching the sunlight. He never thought he'd have moments like these. Simple, perfect moments that made his heart feel full. They found a perfect spot near the water's edge. Jake set up their little camp, making sure Emily had plenty of shade under the umbrella. She was already busy with her plastic shovel and bucket, determined to build the biggest sandcastle possible. "Here, let me show you a trick," Jake said, kneeling beside her. He demonstrated how to pack the wet sand tightly to make stronger walls. Emily watched intently, her face scrunched in concentration. As the morning wore on, their castle grew into an impressive fortress. Jake had never built sand castles before, but he found himself enjoying the simple pleasure of creating something with his daughter. They decorated it with shells they found along the shoreline, each one carefully selected by Emily's discerning eye. "It needs a moat," Emily declared, and together they dug a channel around their creation. When the tide started coming in, Jake taught Emily how to jump the waves. He held her hands tightly as she squealed with delight, her feet leaving the ground as each wave rushed beneath her. Her laughter carried across the beach, pure and joyful. They took breaks to eat sandwiches and fruit, sitting in their beach chairs while watching boats sail past on the horizon. Emily asked questions about everything: the seabirds wheeling overhead, the distant lighthouse, the different shells they found. Jake answered each one patiently, amazed at her curiosity about the world. "Look, Daddy," Emily called out, holding up a perfect sand dollar she'd discovered. "Can we keep it?" "Of course," Jake replied, helping her rinse it in the ocean. "We'll put it somewhere special when we get home." Home. The word felt different now, warmer somehow. Their little apartment wasn't much, but Emily had filled it with life and color. Her drawings covered the refrigerator, her stuffed animals had their own special corner in the living room, and her presence had transformed the once sparse space into something that finally felt like a real home. As afternoon began to fade into evening, they sat together on their beach blanket. Emily leaned against Jake's side, tired but happy, her hair full of salt and sand. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, turning the ocean into liquid gold. Jake looked down at his daughter, this miracle who had changed his life in ways he never thought possible. She had her eyes closed, a peaceful smile on her face, completely trusting and content in his presence. In that moment, Jake knew with absolute certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Jake sat in his favorite armchair, watching Emily arrange her stuffed animals on the living room floor of their new home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air and making Emily's golden hair shine. The walls, once bare, now displayed her colorful artwork, stick figures of her and Jake holding hands, hearts, and rainbows drawn with the pure joy only a child could capture. His eyes drifted to the sand dollar they'd found at the beach, now carefully displayed on a small shelf alongside other treasures they'd collected together. Each item told a story of their growing bond: a pressed flower from their first walk in the park, a tiny seashell from their beach day, and a ribbon from Emily's first school performance. "Daddy," Emily called out, breaking through his thoughts. "Come see. I made everyone a spot for the tea party." Jake smiled and lowered himself to the floor beside her. His massive frame, once intimidating to others, now regularly folded itself into tiny chairs for tea parties and story time. The contrast between his tattooed arms and the delicate toy teacup in his hands would have made his old biker friends laugh, but Jake didn't care. These moments were precious to him. "This is Mr. Whiskers' spot," Emily explained seriously, positioning her favorite teddy bear. "And this is where Princess Sparkles sits." She continued arranging her stuffed animals with careful precision. Looking at her concentrated expression, Jake remembered the frightened little girl he'd met at the train station. She'd been so small, so vulnerable, clutching her teddy bear like a lifeline. Now here she was, confident and happy, filling their home with laughter and love. The journey hadn't been easy. There were still nights when Emily had nightmares about the accident, when she'd crawl into his bed seeking comfort. There were moments when Jake doubted himself, wondered if he was doing enough, being enough. But then Emily would smile at him, call him Daddy with such trust and affection, and all his doubts would melt away. Sarah's recovery had been another blessing. Though they weren't together romantically, they had found a way to co-parent that put Emily's happiness first. Sarah visited often, and Emily had the security of knowing both her parents loved her unconditionally. "Would you like some tea, Daddy?" Emily asked, holding up the plastic teapot with both hands. Yes, please, Princess, Jake replied, holding out his cup. He watched as she carefully pretended to pour, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. After their tea party, Emily asked to play outside in their small backyard. Jake followed her out, settling into a lawn chair while she chased butterflies through the grass. The yard wasn't much, just a patch of green with a small swing set he'd built himself. But to Emily, it was a wonderland of possibilities. The afternoon sun warmed his face as he watched her play. Emily's laughter echoed through the air as she spun in circles, arms outstretched, her dress twirling around her. She was the picture of pure joy, unburdened by the heavy things that had once threatened to overshadow her life. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that spread through him like sunshine. This little girl had changed everything. She'd taken a hardened man who'd lost his way and shown him what it meant to love unconditionally. She'd given him purpose, helped him heal old wounds he didn't even know he had. Emily caught his eye and waved enthusiastically, her smile bright enough to light up the whole world. Jake waved back, his heart full to bursting with love for his daughter. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.